Good evening and welcome to our discussion tonight, Racism, Discrimination, and Empathy. My name is Takesha Dewan Everett, and I am serving tonight as the moderator for this wonderful discussion. The goal is to keep it a little bit more casual since we're all working from home to make it feel like we're in our homes together having a wonderful conversation about a really deep and important topic. Just a quick overview of tonight's conversation. We're going to be together until about 8 o'clock, and the goal is to keep us right on time and to end on time in order to respect everyone's time. Our conversation is being broadcasted and recorded by our partners at Hartford Public Access, and it will be available right now, streaming live through their website at HPA-TV.org. You can also catch this on channel 96 if you're having any trouble seeing us through the internet. Later, this will be uploaded for further review on YouTube. As I mentioned before, we're going to be together between 6 and 8 o'clock, and to respect each other's time, I'm going to not only serve as the moderator, but serve as an excellent timekeeper. I'm going to try to keep us on point and on time and offer the opportunity for everyone's voices to be heard and to respect everyone's time, just making sure we can hear from everyone. When it is your time to speak, I may try to gently cut you off or give you a look to encourage you to keep your comments brief. But I want to start by bringing to the table the person who brought us all together. This entire event was the brainchild and operation of Council President Mally Rosado, and I'd love you to start us off by giving a few introductory remarks. Mally?
Yes, thank you, Keisha, and thank you for everyone, and thank you the viewers that are watching us right now, to all of our panelists who made the time to be here with us. And I wanted to start off by saying that we are an 85% minority city. We have a unique perspective on racism and discrimination. The issues facing our country are felt more deeply here in Hartford by more of our residents. The perception is, and rightfully so, that as a city, we do not do enough to elevate Black and Brown voices. And we recognize that a large part of that has to do with equitable access. Thank you, Keisha.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we do have a really robust discussion tonight and a wonderful agenda. I do want to start us off by having each of the panelists introduce themselves. So I'm going to try to do this by how I see people, and I'm only going to call your name and then leave it over to you to give us a little understanding of who you are, your name, where you work, or how you where you work, and tell us a little bit about how you're coming to this conversation. And remember, I'm wanting you each to kind of bring your own flavor to this, but I also have a timekeeping record. I also have a timekeeping job here. So starting with who I see first after Mally, I'm going to go to the chief of police. You can start us off.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. Jason Thody, I'm the chief of police here in Hartford. I started with the Hartford Police Department 24 years ago as a police cadet, and I've been here ever since. And I think I'm in this conversation because of the impact that policing can have when it comes to race. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much. And next up, Arunan.
Thank you, Takesha, and thank you to Mally for putting this together and for your leadership on this, and to all of these panelists. I'm looking forward to learning from each of you. My name's Arunan. I am at the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection, but coming to this conversation largely as a resident of this city. And I live in the south end of Hartford. I've got Black and brown children, and you know, I think about how cute they are now. They're 6, 5, and 4, and people like their pictures on Facebook and Instagram. But as a dad, I worry about how much time I have between now and that time in which they start to look threatening to people, and I have to sit them down and steal a piece of their innocence and discuss that with them, and it breaks my heart, and my heart mourns with Black families across the city and brown families who do the same thing. I am a brown person. I can't understand what it's like to live as a Black man in this society, but I've been on side. I've had friends who are police officers and good friends of mine, but I've also been on the side of some really bad interactions with police officers in which I've had a gun pointed at me, in which I've ended up in the back of a police cruiser cuffed because of assumptions that were made of me at a certain time. And I'm a resident in the south end of Hartford, in a neighborhood right in between Berry Square and Frog Hollow, where half of my neighbors, wonderful people who experience racism, the most insidious forms of structural racism in their daily life. Half of my neighbors live in government subsidized housing. They see racism in the school system and in the economic opportunities that are afforded to them. We have Great Depression levels of unemployment in many neighborhoods in this city, including mine. And I think it's easy to breeze over what that means. But when white folks in this country experienced the Great Depression, we mobilized as a nation and we said that that was unacceptable. And we threw all of our resources into changing the social contract in America and creating a new deal for folks in America. And that is happening right now in Black and brown neighborhoods. And there's such a lack of imagination and resources being pumped into that. And I think that's all to say, I come to this discussion not expecting that we can fix 400 years of structural racism in this country by leaning heavily on just our police force or just our civic leaders. I think each of us has to come to the table and be willing to listen to each other, to hear each other's pains and hurts and feel them deeply, and then to reimagine the structures that have led to this. And that's a scary process, because many of us feel comfort in those structures. Many of us have benefited in certain ways in those structures. But I hope to come and learn new things. And I think it lets us off the hook to push this onto certain people. We all have such a long road to go in renegotiating the contract that Black and brown folks have in this country, the social contract we have with Black and brown folks in this country.
Thank you, Arunan. And to the man who needs no introduction, but still should have an introduction and an opportunity to introduce himself, I turn to you now, the mayor. Oh, we can't hear you.
Council President, trying to.
Yes, I apologize, Mayor.
I'm sorry. Oh, you unmuted me. Got it. Sorry. Thank you so much, Takesha, and thank you, Council President Rosado, for calling this conversation together, and really looking forward to the discussion to follow. So I'm Luke Bronin, Mayor of the City of Hartford. Been about 4.5 years as mayor, and over the past few days, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different folks, including a number of young people in our city who have been at the lead of some of the protests that we've seen over the past few weeks, which have all been peaceful and all been incredibly powerful. And the conversations that I've had, I think have really reinforced for me just my obligation and just my need to, as much as I try to listen even more, because there is no question that I don't share the experience of a lot of the people that I represent and work for in the city. And while a lot of the conversation has focused on policing, the frustration and the sense of urgency that so many of those young people that I've been talking with feel really is about those much deeper issues that are the legacy of long-standing structural racism in our community, and the fact that we're in a state with some of the deepest racial and economic segregation in the nation, and that you can have an entirely different experience and set of expectations and hopes and beliefs about what's possible for you based on both the color of your skin and where you grow up and what neighborhood you're in. Even if they're those neighborhoods may be a mile apart. And I think this conversation is happening nationally. It's happening statewide. I think it has to happen a little bit more statewide, but it also has to happen right here in our city a lot more. And I'm just grateful for the chance to have this conversation tonight too.
Great, thank you so much. Jacqueline, you're up next. And Jacqueline, you're frozen a little on my end, but I can't hear you. So let's see if we can work to unmute Jacqueline. Uh-oh, and then I think Jacqueline may have a little technical difficulty. So for the moment, we'll go to Andrea and come back.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Comer. I'm the Executive Director for Educators for Excellence. We are a nonprofit that focuses on making sure that teachers have a seat at the policymaking tables. I am the proud mother of a kindergarten teacher, and I am the prouder wife, or just as proud wife, of a law enforcement officer. I am hoping to bring to this conversation and come away with this conversation a more shared understanding of what racism is. I think it is easy to think about racism in terms of, maybe somebody with a hood or something that happened in Manchester a few days ago. Where the truth of the matter is, racism is not restricted to just the South and is just not isolated. Racism exists in the decisions that people make that reinforce the inequality that exists in this city, in this state, in this country. And so I'm hoping to have two things happen. One, to have the shared understanding, but also to bring the perspective of the wife of law enforcement, because I think that anytime you paint with a broad brush, nothing good can come of it. And we have to understand that there's, as Meek Mill says, there's layers to this.
Thank you, Andrea. Curtis.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of our organizers and all those watching. My name is Curtis Porter III, and I am the chair for the LGBTQ+ Commission for the City of Hartford, and I am the Family Engagement Specialist for the CREC Open Space Program, and formerly used to work in Hartford Public Schools. And I'm a Hartford resident and own my own home with my fiance, and just bringing that lens of someone who's been in Hartford for about 13 years, coming up here, living in both New Haven and the Valley, and coming up to the capital city, and just bringing that lens of someone who's consistently been engaging with the community through empowering families and especially students through my work, education, and also that Black male and queer perspective that is often misunderstood or pushed to be silent. So thank you for having me, and I'm proud to be here.
Thank you, Curtis. Iran.
Yes, hi. First, thank you so much, Mali, for putting this together and for inviting me to be at the table. My name is Iran Nasario. I'm the president and CEO of the Peace Center of Connecticut. I'm a Hartford born and raised young man. I love the city of Hartford, love my people in the city of Hartford. And I've come to this conversation as a survivor of a system that unfortunately shipped me through its system and kind of had its grips on me for many, many years. And I didn't know my rights, so I didn't know that that was not normal. So for me, this conversation is really about not only enlightening my my way of thinking, but also, as Andrea mentioned, have a shared understanding of what it is that we're dealing with, but also hoping to leave this conversation with some possible action steps on how we make our community more whole, more connected, so we can understand each other a little bit better. I tend to believe that I have an open heart and an open mind for individuals, no matter where you come from. But I know that um, that same feeling is not always shared towards me in the communities that I visited. So that's my purpose here. I'm hoping to learn from all of you. There's a number of you that I've never met. So it's my honor to meet you, and I'm thankful for your work, and I'm looking forward to having a great dialogue with you.
Excellent, thank you. And Louis.
Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Louis L. Reed. I'm the national organizer for #Cut50. Cut 50 is a bipartisan criminal justice initiative co-founded by CNN political commentator and Reform Alliance CEO Van Jones and also Jessica Jackson as well. I am a lifelong resident of the city of Bridgeport. Bridgeport in the house. You know how we do, right? I know we were working with Hartford, but we do a lot of work, particularly in the city of Hartford. TJ Clark, who is our lead state organizer through the Empathy Network, is one of our most valuable assets. We have worked extensively with the current administration in the city of Hartford, and I'm just adding here to add value to the conversation.
Thank you. Excellent. And I know Jacqueline is coming in and out of our feed, and so I'm hopeful that she'll have an opportunity to introduce herself when we get more into the comments. But just so everyone knows, Jacqueline Manning is from New Light Investigations and is again a part of our conversation tonight. If we see her come back on, we'll definitely give her an opportunity to engage. So as a reminder, tonight we're talking about racism, discrimination, and empathy. And it's a timely conversation, particularly given all that is going on in the country today. Right now, across the country and even in our own state, we're facing a combination of individuals who are living through and living with a pandemic we've never seen before that came to us in COVID-19, and that is ravaging our populations at disproportionate levels, particularly the communities of color. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of civil and social unrest as a response to the injustices that we are seeing in places across the country, Atlanta, in Georgia, as well as in other states and country. And just as it was mentioned earlier, a few days ago, right in the neighboring town near us. So that's the backdrop of why we're having this conversation. It's a conversation that many said in their introduction is long overdue. And I think we have such a dynamic panel with a lot of different and rich experiences. So I just kind of want to get right in there. And looking at the fact that this is the state of our country, I want to give an opportunity for our elected officials who serve and are elected by the populace to represent the city of Hartford. That fundamentally is your job, is to kind of be the voice of the people when you are in your position. So I want to kick it to Mally first and have you share some of your thoughts about what's the current state of race relations in the city of Hartford. And you're on mute, Mally. So just as a reminder, you might want to unmute yourself. And that's for everybody. I'll try to remind you.
I apologize. Thank you for that question. That is a great question. So just as I stated before, the city of Hartford is an 85% minority city, and we have a unique perspective on racism and discrimination. What happened with George Floyd was a rude awakening to the nation, but there are so many George Floyd's situations. And one of the reasons why I wanted to get this panel together is I've been invited to a lot of panels and discussions, and I see that in these discussions, they really don't talk about discrimination, racism. I hear a lot of defunding the police department, but it is so much bigger than that. And I've also been in conversations where they talk, we need to start the healing process. We can't start a healing process unless we deal with the root of the problem. And so as I watched the video of George Floyd, it was horrific. I even cried because I said to myself, for 8 minutes, someone had a knee to his neck and no one said anything. So when do we say as human beings in that situation or in any situation where somebody is discriminating against you or saying a racial slur that we're not going to take it, that enough is enough? So that's where I'm at right now as an elected official. Mayor Bronin has had many discussions this week with all ages. So we're really listening to what the residents of the city of Hartford are saying, and we're trying to put in place task force, advisory groups in a way where we can look at what the worst case situation might be and do it in a way where it works for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And as a reminder, I am probably going to my best ability, refer to you by your first names as if we're friends. And to also try to bring this into a really personal and calm conversation that we should have. So I'm going to turn to Luke, who I've never really called Luke, so this is fun to say right now. Luke, same question. As an elected official, as the mayor of the city, what are your thoughts about the state of race relations in Hartford right now? And I don't know, there we go.
Sorry, Mayor.
Sorry, I keep forgetting. First of all, you can call me Luke anytime. You know, something I've been thinking a lot about over the last few weeks, and especially over the last few days, is what voices I hear and what voices I work hard to hear. You know, on Friday, there were about 1,000 people, 1,000 protesters who came to my door, literally to my door, and I spoke to them as much as you can have a conversation in that setting. Tried to have a conversation. One of the things that I said there is, I have an obligation to listen to all the voices, and I hear your voices, and I'm here to listen to your voices today. But I also have to listen to the thousands of residents who I've talked to year after year throughout our city. And I believe that's true. But one of the things that I think I've really taken to heart more over the last few days than I have previously is that the voices I hear most of the time are those who feel in some way connected to or part of our democratic system. You know, I talk more to voters than those who are not registered to vote. You know, I go and knock on doors, and including going into apartment buildings and sometimes sneaking in a door and trying to knock on any door. But the truth is, I probably talk to more folks who are homeowners than those who are in big apartment buildings, just because it's harder to access those buildings. I probably talk more to older Hartford residents than I do to younger Hartford residents, even though I try to go to schools and engage with our young people quite a lot. But I guess one of the things I take from that is, even when we're talking about race relations, we're not just talking about black, brown, and white. We're talking about enormous differences in experiences and perspectives within our community at every age group, in every neighborhood, every set of experiences. And one of the things, again, that's just brought home for me in a really kind of deep way is the need to hear more voices that aren't necessarily the ones that are usually standing up and asking to be heard. And that I've got an obligation to try to do that a lot more. And that in this moment, that's more important than ever. I don't know that really gets to your question, but that's sort of what your question, makes me think about, in part just because what I've been thinking about so much over these last few days.
Thank you. And so, I mean, let's just get into the heart of it. I mean, a lot of the conversation or the comments so far, a lot is centered on listening. And tonight we have an opportunity to listen together and to hear from each other. And I think Andrea might have said it first, but I can't remember. It was definitely mentioned that we can't fix the problem if we don't name a problem and if we're not on one accord about what the problem is. And so just last night, the city of Hartford passed a resolution saying that racism is a public health issue, but let's tonight as a collective, let's define what that means. What are we talking about when we say racism? And Jacqueline, I can see you. I want to ask you to take yourself off mute. And I'm going to go to you first. And when you start answering that question about what is racism, what does that mean? Just tell us first who you are and then go right into it.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about my technical difficulties. I'm Jackie Manning. I own New Light Investigations. We're a Hartford-based private detective agency, and my background is in journalism, criminal justice reform, criminal defense, and civil rights. And I've been an independent investigator for the Civilian Review Board in Hartford since 2009. And I'm just coming to this conversation because having been on the front lines, as a criminal defense investigator, like witnessing what's happening in the criminal justice system in its entirety, I've seen the systematic oppression within the law. So when you're saying within the whole context of the law, so So when you're saying like, what is it? Like, let's name it. And really, I feel like throughout my experience and like being on the front lines and just watching the oppression taking place, it's the whole context of the law. It's from, it's to probation. It's like from, being charged to being put into the criminal justice system, kind of being swept in. And there's probation, and then there's the prosecution, and we live in an extremely penalizing criminal justice system. There's not much room for redemption. And so for me, like the way that I see the racism, it's systemic, and it's been happening for years and years, where our rights, our civil rights, have been looted actually. Through case law, what we have is all of our rights, our First Amendment rights, our Fourth Amendment rights, our 13th Amendment rights, our 14th Amendment rights. And then throughout the course of decades, there's an exception to the amendment. There's an exception. And so over time, we built all this case law that as soon as you're swept into the criminal justice system, you just slowly have your rights sort of taken away. And we don't, it's not like you do your time and it's over. You live with a felony, and that comes with ramifications that create barriers to economic, thriving and educational thriving and all of that. So it's buried and it's hidden within the law. And as soon as you get swept into the criminal justice system, it's a revolving door for recidivism. So I think that we live in a very penalizing, we have this penalizing, and the racism is just so hidden within all these cases and case law that completely loot our civil rights. That's from my perspective what it is, and it's so hidden. And then we say it's law. We say it's the law, and it's like we have to rethink what we're enforcing as law. That's my perspective.
Thank you, Jackie. So great. So I forgot to say at the top of this, when I get to a question, I'm going to really call on two people first and then open it up, because this isn't just call on it and for a call on you kind of forum tonight. And just so the listeners know, everyone who's with me tonight have no idea what my questions are. They kind of know topics, but they don't know what the questions are. So even if they have to take a moment to process what that question is before they answer it, I think that brings just a nice dynamic into this. So next I'm going to go to Andrea. Same question. What is racism? Like, it was your hope that we have this call tonight, that we have a shared definition. Kick us off with following Jackie and telling us what's your take on this? What does it mean?
Yeah, so similarly to Jackie, I think it is about the systems, right? And I had mentioned during the intro, it's convenient to think about the person who puts on a hood. It's convenient to think about the officer who puts his knee on a Black man's neck because he doesn't see a man. But racism exists in so many subtle ways.
Yes.
And that's where we need to start looking at and start chipping away at. Racism is about the fact that we talk about racism existing in the South when there are 20 states all over this country that are segregated, right? There are 20 states that have largely disproportionate prison populations, right? So that's also racism. So it's about, are you making these decisions that are reinforcing racial inequality? Are you voting for something that results in redlining? Are you voting for 3 strikes and you're out? When you know that although Black and brown men make up such a small portion of our nation's population, they are disproportionately incarcerated. To me, those are the things that are racist, right? So we have to get out of this mindset of thinking that it is the extreme, because yes, that's racism, but there are systems and there are decisions that people make, people who will say they're not racist and probably don't think that they're racist, but they will make these decisions that will support policies and efforts that disproportionately impact Black and brown people.
Thank you. That's great. All right. The floor is open. How do others define racism or see it even taking place in our society today?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here. Considering that I'm probably the resident X. And when I'm talking about X, I'm talking about having served almost 14 years in federal prison. I think that I have both an inside, outside perspective and also an outside, inside perspective. So I went to an alternative high school and an unaccredited college, so I'm not going to use words that are as palatable as my colleagues, but let me just give it to you what racism is. Racism is, yes, it is institutionalized. Yes, it is underneath. Yes, it is kind of like this conspiracy, right? But racism is also when we are driving through the Bloomfields of Connecticut, when I'm driving through the Fairfields of Connecticut, and I happen to be in my BMW, or I happen to be in a car that an officer doesn't think that I should be driving, and I get stopped for DWB, which is called driving while black to our viewing audience. That's racism. Racism is also when I have been impacted by the criminal justice system, and there are more than 46,000 collateral consequences as a result of having that conviction. Can't get a job, can't get housing. In some states, you can't get social services. You are discriminated against at every single turn you take. So there is this institutionalized bias. There is this institutionalized prejudice. There is this institutionalized notion that is built into our system that, yes, it disenfranchises folks, but for the folks where I come from, right? You know, I come from the street corners of Bridgeport, Connecticut. I come from the Father Panic villages and the Stratford Avenues, right? You know, and when I was criminalized, when I was doing criminal enterprising, as we used to say in the street, the fix is in. The fix is in. And when we're dealing with racism, we are talking about people who don't look like you, the white power structures that are in the United States of America that essentially want to keep folks down. And what we saw happen in Minneapolis, we've been saying that in my family for years. For years, the white man got his foot on our neck, and that was that was something that was an illustrated sermon of the sort, where we saw that former officer have his foot on the neck of a black man, which is indicative and a reflection of what happens with black people in this country, literally as far north as Vermont to as far west as Oregon. And I just took that that geography course, so I was very happy to say that I know the furthest points north and also west. But I just wanted to say, like, that's what racism is. And, you know, we can put these flowery words on it, but when it comes to, you know, folks where I come from, that's what we call racism. You can't drive in certain places. You can't have your music at a certain decibel. You can't even walk into Macy's or Lord and Taylor and look like you come out of a Jeezy video without being followed around. That's what racism is, period.
Well, can I follow that?
Come on, Iran, go for it.
Can you hear me? Well,
Yes.
someone said to me that I sound low, and that's just the way my voice is. So I'll do my best to project as much as I can. I'm gonna agree with my brother simply because, again, I share some of the similar experiences as you, having had my first interaction with a law enforcement officer when I was 11, and I was kicked in my face and threatened to be thrown down the stairs. My mom was drug dealing and whatever, and that kind of spiraled me into the DCF system, into the court system, and serving state and federal time. I saw firsthand what the system can do to you if you don't know, your parents don't know, your grandparents don't know all the protections that exist. But racism to me is a concerted, planned effort from way before our time to dismantle any possible hopes that we have of success. And through the efforts of so many that have died before us, and I know people are saying, well, whoever died before us is not relevant. It is relevant. It's relevant because we are able to have these dialogues and these discussions. We have a lot more work to do, but this is a system that has been designed in many ways to capitalize on our suffering, not only from the prison system to all of these other systems, redlining, you name it. All of these things are derived from fear that we as colored people are going to take and dismantle whatever successes and lifestyles that people that don't look like us currently have. So the more successful we are, the more the systems will put things in place in order to check us, to kind of keep us where we are. Look at the people on the screen, including everyone here. If you look at the color of our skin, we were made to be labeled as evil for so many years that there were shows that were created with the intention of showing us as evil, cold-hearted criminals that brings fear into the lives of people that eventually become racist. Racism is taught by so many different ways and by so many different media outlets and angles and parents and you name it, that believe that the people that they don't know, that the people that they have been seeing on these monitors are the people they should fear. And when fear grips someone, it's easy to then cast judge on someone. It's easy to then set somebody aside because you don't want to get to know them. When you are fearful and you begin to hate, the first thing you start doing is not listening, which is what we said we would do today. Because if I hate you, I'm not going to listen to you. You want to go talk about a relationship. If we're dating each other and we hate each other, the last thing we want to do is hear each other's voices. So the facts are that hate runs deep when fear is present. And this systemic setup, this design is made and built for us to not have these conversations, to have us separated by color, by race, by gender, by classification, etc. Because fear is the #1 grip in our hearts that doesn't allow us to have love for others. So I do agree. I again agree with the other panelists. Just kind of thinking about how superior individuals feel when they are racist towards another class. How powerful you feel when then you have a voice that tells you it's okay to do that. Just imagine that power. I can relate because in my criminalization, right, when I was out there doing what I was doing, I remember the more encouragement I had to be bad, the worse I was. And there's no different in racism. The more that it is fanned and the more that people believe that it's right and is righteous and that other person is not real or doesn't exist or is less than, the more it's going to be prevalent and the more I believe people are going to react to you in this way. And it's just manifesting itself in many different ways. And people are stepping up and we're chipping away. I call it the ripple effect on the water. We just started. We just throw a little rock and the pebble and the water is moving and we're excited, but we can't be excited. We got to use these platforms to continue to make the right impact and more of a wave in that water and eventually a tsunami in that water where eventually people have to pay attention. So we're sounding the alarm, but this is why I think racism is. This is what I definitely think racism is.
Thank you, Iram. I see a hand from Nally. Unmute yourself, Nally. Get in here.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation was, like I said before, I've been into participating in so many meetings, but we never get to the big elephant in the room, right? We don't go there. So I said, I'm going to start asking people, what is racism to them? And one said to me, a state of mind. And the other one would say, well, it's a white person feeling that they're superior from a colored person. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to go to the dictionary that says one of the Blacks, the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another, right? And so I started thinking, how do we as a society move forward with racism? I mean, are we ever going to be able to change human behavior? Where does it start? How do we make change? How do we follow that change so that it happens? And so, that's what I want to leave you guys with, is it a state of mind? Where do you think, or how do you think we should move forward to deal with racism?
It's a question out there.
Does it start at your household? Is it transferred from your parents because that's what their mothers taught? When do we say, you know what, from now on in my household, I am not going to teach my children what I was taught, or I am not going to transfer that over? Where do we start as humanity to move forward? Because we have to. If not, it's going to get worse, or we're never going to be able to fix it.
So that's an excellent question. There's a question out to you all. Nally has presented it. Where do we start? So I've heard a couple of themes here around racism and how it's shown, how it shows up in our laws and how we criminalize people, how we demonize individuals, how we create fear, even in our language. We talk about dark versus light, and that we all know what that translates to and what that means. So how do we fix it? Where do we start? Where do we start in terms of dealing with racism? And I think Nally said, is it in your home? And there may be other options. And I know we can hear from some other people, Curtis, Arun, and other of you. Come on, Curtis.
Absolutely. So
Yeah, go ahead, Curtis.
thank you. And so, it's great that you threw that question out there, because in education, we often run into, okay, what are we teaching in school, right? And or trying to teach, and then when the students go home, right, what is the conversation, or what is the education being at home? And so oftentimes, from my experience, when students go to school, it's like, okay, we're trying to teach them to be inclusive, depending on where you go to school at, I should say, right? I want to throw that in there, be mindful of that. And we try to teach them to go off into the world and do all they can do. We try to educate them on the importance of, if you are a Black or brown student and you're going to school somewhere else, oh, you need to code switch, or you need to change, and things like that, right? And we're doing all this in education, but then when the students go home, right? Whatever, if that education is not being taught at home, and or the community is not uplifting the same values, then really, what are we doing, right? And so that's something that we often talk about, and that I think, making sure that we know, if we are going to do something in education, it can't only happen there. It has to also happen in the community as well. It has to be with parents. It has to be an inclusive conversation and relationship building. And it won't happen if folks stay in silos, right? We can have all these different pockets, but if folks aren't working together, if folks aren't having the conversation in the same space, whether it's difficult or not, then it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward with any of this. And I think about my experiences in my presence, and I don't feel that I am a person who comes in and intimidates folks, right? I don't feel like I present that. However, I have been in experiences where, just because I am Black and a male, right, that when I'm in the space, there are folks who feel like they need to kind of come at me harder, meaning, right, downplay my experience, downplay that I have an education, like, oh wow, like you have this, or downplay, my life situations with my fiance and things like that, and kind of just throw it to the side. And I think that and folks just need to be mindful of that, and know that it needs to encompass all of us, right? And just not in silos. So I think if we're going to start anywhere, it needs to be holistic. And if we're going to talk about children, right, no, then it needs to be their families, and then also it needs to encompass.
Thank you, Curtis. Arunan, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Curtis. And I'm for so many of you guys who have shared your experiences, I appreciate the vulnerability on this panel. I want to pick up on a thread, and I think, Mally, that was a great question. I want to pick up on a thread that Andrea had mentioned. I think other people have sort of mentioned along the way, which is that racism isn't just a racist police officer with his knee on the neck of a Black man, right? And all of the ways in which, that might be the tip of the iceberg, in which everyone can see, and below it is the mass of racism that folks in this country are dealing with. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote an article that many of you might have read, in which he described it as a dust that we are all choking on, and until you start to shine light on it, it's hard to recognize. It's hard for people to recognize, and I think a lot of folks have kind of alluded to that. And so I think, one of the really harmful dynamics when we talk about racism is that people try to make it about racists, and there's something really cathartic in that for someone who's looking at this, because they can say, well, that guy, that police officer, that KKK guy with the robe, he's a racist, and I'm not a racist. I'm just doing the best I can. That guy's a racist, and it lets folks off the hook from doing real work. And I think the more we talk about this as a system in which we all participate in which we all have culpability in, and are slaves to, and are all frankly oppressed by, right? All of us live less rich lives when our Black brothers and sisters are oppressed in this society. And it doesn't matter if you're Black or white or brown. It impacts all of us negatively. And I think the more we can shift the dialogue to helping people understand the pieces of that system that interact with their life without, I mean, this defensiveness comes up, I think, when people feel like they're being called a racist. And I don't think it's, whether or not they are, broadly as a person, a racist, that dichotomy, I think, ignores the pervasiveness of racism in America that touches all of us. And I think the more we can move away from talking about people who are racist and not racist towards talking about systems of oppression and the ways in which those impact each of our lives, and speak up when we see it, right? And I think I hear so many of my friends on the right complain about how PC our culture is. And I always say being politically correct is, as people perceive it, is just everyone else being afforded the same rights that have been afforded to straight white men for generations. You're not allowed to talk about racism. You're not allowed to talk about the ways in which people's actions and words are perpetuating systems of racism. That is a PC culture that is pushed on Black and brown people. And I think it's time to start breaking out of that and to lovingly address issues that we see in the workplace, issues that we see in our kids' schools, in our daily lives, in our clubs, in our social circles, and dealing with the awkwardness of that, because I think that the more we can move away from this dichotomy of racist and non-racist, the richer lives we will all lead for it.
Thank you. Jason, Luke, either of you want to add anything? Because I have a pivot that I'm about to do, but I don't want to leave you out on this question about what is racism.
I think that what Arunan just said, and it echoes what other people said, is so important, because the definition that Mally read of what racism is what I think a lot of people think of it as, that it's what somebody has to have in their head or in their heart in order to be racist. But I think that there's a lot of people, a lot of white folks who really struggle and don't understand the term systemic racism until they begin to see the examples that are really hard to ignore. And it's not just the big examples like criminal justice. I mean, one of the things that really first got me involved in public policy was teaching at the New Haven Correctional Center and teaching GD classes and some poetry classes, and realizing there were a number of kids in there, young men in there, who were about my same age, and a number of them were in there for things that my peers at college were doing, and were ended up in a very different place because they started in a very different place, and also because they look different. And so that was pretty hard to ignore. But one of the things that even in a conversation that I had yesterday, that I hadn't really appreciated before. I had some of the students, the young people yesterday saying, asking me to say that the U.S. military should not be allowed to come and recruit in high schools anymore. And I'm a veteran. I served in the Navy, and so my first reaction is, well, I don't agree with that. I want everybody to have that choice and that opportunity. But it also, on reflection, became clear to me that that's felt and heard and in a very different way when it's presented as the only option, or when it's presented again and again and again, not as this noble way to serve your country, but saying you want to feed your family, you should join the military, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that it's in both ways that are big and impossible to ignore, and also in ways that are subtle and insidious, as others have said. Similarly, confronted it. I think I did a town hall tour a couple of years ago of towns around Hartford, talking about why every town in the area would benefit from having a stronger Hartford, and the racism that was sort of on display in those meetings was not all that thinly veiled, but I'm also not sure that a lot of the folks who were expressing it were all that conscious of it. And that racism is also reinforced by things as mundane as land use laws and zoning laws. And I think those are some of the things that are now part of this discussion right now that really haven't been part of the discussion enough.
Can I just add something that the mayor, to expound on something that the mayor just said? Look, MLK said that there is nothing in this world that's more dangerous than either sincere ignorance or conscientious stupidity. And so, the fact of the matter is that just because people aren't aware of something doesn't give them an excuse. I'm certain that the chief can speak to this issue, right? Ignorance of the law, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Right? You can still be arrested. You're still going to be prosecuted. You're probably still going to be, if you happen to be black, brown, or red in this country, you're still going to be excessively prosecuted and disproportionately sentenced. It's not an excuse. While I do understand what the mayor is saying, that it does give us an understanding, it's definitely not an excuse. And I don't want to let anybody off the hook. Look, I'll pause for a brief commercial break and I'll toss it back over to you because I start cooking with Crisco. I start cooking with Crisco when you start talking like this, man. So I'm gonna toss it back over to Keisha. But I appreciate the mayor's sentiments. I just wanted to expound on it.
Can I respond real quick? Because I think I agree with what you're saying. Part of what I was saying is that I think that one of the things that we need to shine a light on is that you don't need to you don't even need to be racist to be complicit in racism, and you don't need to be racist to be ignoring things that are reinforcing racism in a really powerful way. And unless we are consciously calling those things out, we're not going to make the kind of progress that we need to make. Because you can think of yourself as the person who doesn't feel any differently about somebody because of the way they look, and also somebody who is very comfortable with the fact that your town has no affordable housing and has exclusionary zoning and all these other things that actually have a really powerful effect. So that was the point I was making, is that I think that sometimes people shut off to the conversation, or they don't engage in a serious way in the conversation because they put up the wall at the start and say, well, I'm not racist, so I don't really need to worry about this. But actually, you do.
Right. I mean, I think that's the insidious nature of racism, right? It exists in ways that we can see it. So there's this conversation, and I will admit, in being the moderator, I'm a little overly educated on stuff like this. So I may go into like deep words and thoughts, but I'm trying to pull myself out of it because this is supposed to be conversational. But there are three ways in which racism exists, and interpersonal is the way we can see it. So if I tell you I don't like you, I use words that are clearly against you. Then clear and visual. We can see that, and we can all feel comfortable, as others have said, in saying, well, that's racism and that's a racist. Then there's the internalized piece before I get to the institutional. So then there's the internalized piece where we're getting these messages. Society is telling us, who are Black and brown people, that these are the problems and this is how you're supposed to be. So now we've internalized this, and we basically have this kind of fait accompli that we now have to do these things that we have been told to do. Yeah, we are bad, and we did this to ourselves, and it's an individual behavior thing that we need to correct. But then there's that piece that we can't even see, the institutional piece. And if we talk about this in policing, which this conversation tonight is not about policing, but it's the example that's coming to my mind. It isn't the representation of whether I sit here and ask if any one individual police officer or police person is racist. It is the system of understanding how policing from its origin is built on a foundation of racism, and how we then create laws and actions and people and training and things within that to do it. So it's not a conversation of whether there's one good police officer or whether there are 10 good police officers, or, well, wait, it's not me. It's the conversation of how are we changing the structures that produce the discrimination we see. And so that's the pivot, right? The pivot and the question that I have for you now is, racism is the thing we can't see. Discrimination is the thing we do. Like, we can see that visually. As I think Mally said, racism can be our state of mind. It can be our way of being, but the discrimination is the action we actually see. So let's kind of talk about that. What does discrimination look like right now? Like, what are examples, concrete, tangible examples that anyone can give? Some of you have already done that, but there may be others that you want to elevate in the conversation around discrimination. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on it because there have been a number already, but there's some others that haven't. And I want to bring that in the notion of intersectionality even into this. Like, how are the ways that we produce that racism in the form of discrimination? And that's the question. I'm going to stop. I got excited there for a second. Who's saying about the panel tonight? I think it was Lewis's energy. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so you know, it's interesting because discrimination to me, and I had an experience probably just a few, actually it was the winter time. There's a market in downtown Hartford, and I gone in there just to grab some quick things. I was literally followed around every aisle and ultimately didn't buy anything because, but I think what discrimination is that it is just looking at people blanket. So yes, maybe I may not phrase things the way Lewis does, but it's not going to protect me anymore when I walk into a store because they don't care how I talk and they don't care what I'm wearing and they don't care what I'm driving. They see a Black person and they automatically have decided that I must be in there to steal something. That's discrimination for me.
Thank you.
Well, if I can share just two examples quickly. First, regarding my son's 20 years old. He started working at a place here in Connecticut, and day two of his experience, he looks a lot like me. Has the puffy hair all over the place and scruffy beard. You know, when they're out there doing their thing, but he has a job and he knows what he's doing. And he was approached by someone. And immediately started berating him because of the fact that not only did he look Latino, but he also had this style that that person deemed unworthy of the job. And mind you, that person didn't work there. That person was a customer that felt that it was appropriate to advise my son that he didn't look the part, that he didn't fit with the mark or the branding of that business. Fast forward, my son gets let go because they say that they didn't need him anymore. That was it. That was sufficient to let him go. Looking back on that, I know for a fact that when the gentleman went inside, my son, he saw him complaining to one of the managers. That's racism to me, because my son didn't lose the job for underperforming. He lost the job because someone that looked like the constituent or the customer went in and made enough of a stinker about it that my son was let go, and my son was devastated. But this is the kind of thing that is light but can impact someone, because if you look at his work record, you'll then start seeing that if he's let go from places that practice that racism because of the way he looks, eventually when he goes to apply somewhere, they say, well, it seems to me that you've been let go from these places, when in reality it wasn't for performing. It's always because we don't need you anymore, or we didn't need you anymore. And that's a cover up for some of the racism that our young people experience. So I just wanted to share that story because it happened, and I remember having to console him and have the conversation with him about what sometimes people see without getting to know him can impact his job or his role at a job. So that's what racism definitely can look for me as far as a personal experience, beyond others, but that.
Thank you.
Something, if I could jump in. So
Yeah.
something that I think about as well, specifically what here in Hartford in our bordering towns, right? So we all know, for those who drive around the city, we have panhandlers, right, who are at the borders of Hartford, and there's a plethora of them, and I think about one, right, the bias of Hartford is that folks are poor, they don't have this, they can't do that, or whatever, right? However, you have these panhandlers who are consistently in the town, right? They're predominantly white, right? And nobody, it's just like, okay, they're here, fine, whatever. And our community is accepting because clearly they come back because they're getting money. However, flip that lens. And if it was folks of color panhandling in our bordering towns, right? What would that narrative look like, right? Oh my goodness, they look like they're going to attack me, or they're gonna steal from us, right? Or they're on any kind of substance, and I could just go on and on and on. And I think that that's something that also folks don't really take a look at, is like, okay, I may not feel like I'm racist, however, but if the situation was flipped, more than likely, right, that would be the narrative. And so then that's that subtle part that folks, right, may not even realize that is internal within them. And I think that that's something to also discuss and talk about. And then also I want to highlight pacing for privilege, right? And what that looks like. And that could be in the workplace, that could be in the community, where it's like, oh, no, 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 no. Like, I hear you and I'm with you, but we'll get to that at another time, right? And so they're kind of just giving you just enough, right? So that you think change is going to happen because it may not be affecting them right now personally. And so that's that pacing for privilege piece that, you know, you might have allies who you think are really truly your allies. However, they're just trying to give you just enough just to keep you satisfied. And that's something I also want to bring to the forefront. You know what I mean?
Thank you. The fierce timekeeper I am, I have a few more kind of moments in this section. And just again, as a reminder for our listeners, we're talking about racism, discrimination, and empathy with a specific focus on Connecticut and particularly Hartford. So one of the ways in which we've talked, people talk about how we deal with racism, and we're going to move into another solution, but I want to put this one on the table, is the thought that representation matters. And several times tonight, Mally's already mentioned that Hartford is 85% people of color. And it's really important, again, for a lot of people to see themselves when they look at the leadership of the city. So I'm curious to hear from those who live in the city, who work in the city, what are the current efforts that are underway to ensure that our elected, appointed, and police all represent or have positions that are representative of the people? And I'm actually going to call on Jason first because we haven't heard your voice yet in this particular section, though I know we are going to hear more from you in the next one, but I'm going to call on you first.
Sure, thank you. So Hartford is like you said, is a predominant minority city, and our police department is almost, well, not quite opposite, but it's an opposite reflection of that. We have law enforcement for years has been a predominantly white male profession. So we have started to take a lot of strides here to try to change that. We've developed, in the last 5 or 6 years, we've developed a recruitment division to go out there and try to attract not just a higher percentage of minority representation in the department, but people that live in the city and understand the city. Every city has its own nuances and cultures, and Hartford's no exception. So we really started pushing our cadet program, where we hire some of our youth when they get to be age 18, and a lot of those cadets come out of the Explorer program and the PAL program, and we pay them and we get them ready for a life of law enforcement. They're out there. They were out there today handing out masks up on Main Street. So we get them, they were born here, raised here, and they're a great pipeline to the future of our department. We also try, there's a lot of barriers to become a police officer, whether it's the psychological, the polygraph, credit checks. It's an extensive process because it's a balance. In law enforcement, we want to make sure that we're selecting the right people for the job, people with empathy, people that are going to have understanding, not the not the RoboCops, not the warriors. We're not looking for that. So we balance a process that's really selective with making it open enough so we get a good diverse group. And I mean that, in race, I mean that in language, and sexual orientation, gender. That's what we're looking for in our department, is an understanding department. So we've done a lot of things here. We just started we've had a civilian review board here that looks at subjective cases that aren't automatic disqualifiers, where members of the community are on that board. They look at facts. They don't know the age, the gender, they don't know the race of the individual. So if we have somebody that, that might be on the bubble as to whether we want to hire them or not, we have this review board, the subjective review board, that includes both police officers and members of the community that look at it. That's not something that you see everywhere. It's worked out pretty well for us here in Hartford. We just this last year instituted financial literacy. We saw that some of the individuals, especially from the city, were getting eliminated for credit issues. So we implemented financial literacy programs here that we work with our applicants And if they sign on to go through the financial literacy program, that issue is brought to the subjective board or brought to me to say, look, this individual is working on this. Health and nutrition, that's a big issue in the city. So we saw a lot of our applicants that came from the city were failing the physical agility test. You have to meet this standard, this 40th percentile standard, and that's a regulation that's regulated by the state to go into the academy. What we did was we reduced that standard to 30%, and we waived the fee. It's a $75 fee just to take the test. So city residents take that test for free. And if they can pass at the 30th percentile, we work with our applicants 2 to 3 times a week on health, nutrition, on working out, because if I can get them to that 40th percentile in the 4 or 5 months that it takes to go through the testing process, we've had some successes there. So we're trying to break down some of the barriers to becoming law enforcement in the first place, while we're trying to still make sure that we're being selective and we're putting the right people in a uniform that are going to do the right things. We've mentioned it. I've heard it mentioned quite a few times, but the George Floyd incident it's not a bad cop. That's a bad person. And I think, as a law enforcement executive, I want to do everything that I can to make sure that someone like that is not wearing our uniform and is not representing our department and is not in our community. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we do. A lot of them are on our website. People can take a look at it. And we're always open to new suggestions. Some of the best ideas that we have when it comes to recruitment come from the community. And that's, we're always open to those discussions and continue to be. We learn a lot the more we talk. So.
Thank you.
Can I just weigh in and just push back just on the tail end of what the chief said? Look, I respect the city of Hartford. I respect Mayor Bronin's leadership. I don't know much about the policing in Hartford, but I'm going to say this. That wasn't a bad officer that wasn't a bad person in the George Floyd situation. That was something that was indicative of a bad system. And so if it was a bad officer, then it's okay, look, no harm, no foul. This was an isolated incident. Let's move on from it. But you have what happened in the George Floyd situation, which was a reflection of what happened in the Breonna Taylor situation, which was a reflection on cue, sirens in the background, which was a reflection of what happened in the Philando Castile situation, which was a reflection of what happened with Tamir Rice, which was a reflection of what happened with Jason Negron in Bridgeport, which was a reflection of what happened in Ad Infinitum. So I don't think that we can kind of like minimize and say, hey, that was a bad officer. And I get it, right? Like, you are the chief law enforcement officer in the city of Hartford. You have to hold the line. You have to make sure that morale is up, etc. I dig that. I get it. But from my perspective and where I sit, that's not a reflection of a bad officer. It's a reflection of a flawed system. And what we saw in that system in operation in the George Floyd situation essentially was that, I'm sorry, I got a phone ringing in my ear. Essentially was that it was racism on full display, it was discrimination on full display, and it was that institutionalized bias on full display that we had talked about. And I'm going to answer this call.
Thank you, Booz. And I think go ahead, Andrea, and then I'm going to go to Iran.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just wanted to, because he mentioned systems, which is what I had talked about at the very beginning, right? The system that has allowed for a limited number of Black and brown people to enter the force is connected to the same system that is separate and not equal an education system, which is there's this through line, right? So if we are disproportionately suspending Black and brown boys and girls from school, that starts a snowball effect that is going to increase the likelihood that they're going to have some sort of engagement with the criminal justice system, which is going to increase the likelihood that they can't get the kind of job that they need to pay their bills, which is going to increase the likelihood that they are going to have bad credit, which is going to prevent them from being able to be part of the police force. And so this is what I'm talking about when we need to start looking at the systems that are in place that impact people's abilities to thrive and breathe and live.
Thank you, Angela. Iran, you've been trying to get in here, so.
No, I appreciate Andrew's comments, and again, I think that there are systems, again, coming from a personal experience, not knowing the system. We were punished, my entire family. I mean, out of 6 brothers, we all end up in jail. You know, each and every one of us has seen a prison for one way, and then we're blamed because we were criminals. But again, we started at a very early age, not knowing our rights, not knowing the system. I dropped out of high school, went to prison, etc. All those things that were in play that Andrea mentioned about suspensions and then your reputation precedes you, and then before you know it, system gets in the way, you can't graduate because of whatever that is. But I wanted to go back to Chief Doty for a second, because if you're looking for solutions, and if we're talking about police, one of the best experiences I've had with the Hartford Police Department, and I've been both the person being chased by the police and to working with the police to help stop other young people from getting into the criminal justice system. So I've been on both sides. And the facts are that one of the most effective things that I've ever seen work for me was when the cadet class would allow, or the department would allow cadet classes to have visitors come in that were like me, to talk with them about our experiences with the criminal justice system. Because there, in many instances, officers that are not from our community, the first time they ever see a Latino or an African American is when they're already policing. This is fact. You look at the research and it says that there are few communities in this country that can say they have a Black or Latino friend, or Black or Latino classmate, Black or Latino neighbor. So if you become a law enforcement officer, your first interaction with that culture and whatever it is that we do is as a law enforcement officer. But because I had the experience and the opportunity to speak with 3 different cadet classes, it personally impacted me in crises that I had personally. In one instance, an officer, a female officer from Windsor, Connecticut, arrived at a scene that was a crisis for me. And when she saw me, she said, "I remember you from the cadet class." And the interaction between she and I was so different than what it could have been had I been a stranger, or the first time she ever had contact with a Latino family, which we were one of the rare Latino families in the community I lived at, or the block I lived at in that time. It changed the dynamic of the relationship. It changed the fact that she knew some of the struggles of people in Latino communities, or she knew about the cultural things that we have been through, the racism that we had experienced. So it changed the dynamics, and it changed the interaction. So I want to just say that there is, I know that that's on a very minor level, but if those instances happen enough, then you start to feel a shift in the mindset of people, which we talked about earlier, where interactions are a little more friendly because you have an actual human in front of you. Not a case, not a number, not a crime, but a human. And I think that that is something that we can learn from. Again, it needs to happen at higher levels and systemic and all that. But I just wanted to point out that one experience, because it does exist. I'm personally a witness to it. And I think that that's probably something that we need to continue to engage police in, and making sure that the cadets talk to us and have an opportunity to deal with us. And whether they're from the community or not, we should have that dialogue before they end up being police officers.
And to that point, Iran, I would also like to include in that as well is our folks who are within the LGBTQ plus community, especially my trans folks out there who are also looking to, be involved in different public service industries and things like that. And being able to have that positive perception prior to a negative situation that occurs, and being included in spaces that are intimate, such that you just mentioned.
Just real quick, if it's okay, I just want to say just a couple of quick things. One, when we look back at George Floyd, I'll say this: police departments and law enforcement, there are some cultural things about law enforcement that probably span, the entire law enforcement community. But each department has its own culture as well. And what I saw in Minneapolis was a culture that, allowed someone to be knelt on for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and die. And when you talk to police officers here, no one here can imagine that. So I think there are cultural things within departments. If that's a culture there where something like that is okay, that is a problem. And I agree that that's beyond him just being a bad person. But that's a cultural issue that needs to be reversed in that department. To Iron's point, and I get out there as often as I can. I was on iHeartRadio with him and the Peace Center talking to some of our youth to try to open up a dialogue between us as law enforcement, especially a white male version of a member of law enforcement, and the community that we serve. And I thought we broke down some walls that day with some individuals, and I think if we keep doing that, our relationships will just improve. But we've taken that a step further, where our recruits now, our cadets and our recruits, are going out into the community in events, and they're meeting different people. We do the sock and the shoe giveaway for the homeless. Our recruits, part of their training is that they have to go out. They're going out there and they're helping with those things, and they're meeting people from the community. And those just aren't recruits from Hartford. We do train recruits from West Hartford and East Hartford and Bloomfield, and we do see some benefits to that, because as has been mentioned prior, folks from Hartford drive into these towns. And when we talked earlier about discrimination and what discrimination looks like, racial profiling is discrimination. It's an action based on racism. And our members of our community in Hartford get discriminated against in some of the surrounding towns. So having those officers as part of our training, I think, is important. So those are just the 2 quick points I wanted to make.
All right, thank you. So keeping myself kind of on time, the question here that we started with on this section was about representation and whether representation mattered. Was it sufficient enough to address the issue of racism, and how well or spaces for opportunity does the city of Hartford have? And I think we've heard a variety of responses to that. The other side of this is more deeper than just representation. Representation is important. Being able to see who you are reflected in the leadership and the people that you interact with daily is definitely an important piece of this. Being able to interact helps you to see humanity. And so I want to shift the conversation tonight as we are rounding our last about 40-something minutes of our conversation. As a reminder, we're ending at 8 o'clock and talking about racism and discrimination, which we've addressed. We're now going to talk about empathy. And a lot of our civil rights leaders in the United States have talked about the need for empathy in advancing our conversation around dismantling racism. In 1964, James Baldwin bemoaned the fact that most whites failed to achieve the most basic form of empathy for Blacks. And I think you could even replace the word Black today and add Latino. You could replace that and add our Asian brothers and sisters. You could put any name in there, Native American. But that basic form of empathy is to grasp our humanity. And this has been said several times tonight. So I want to open our dialogue now to talk about what does it mean to have empathy, and how can the expression of and the shift of and the being empathetic and having empathy really address some of the issues we talked about tonight. Go for it, Mally. Oh, Mally and then Lou. We haven't heard from Mally in a while. Unmute, Mally. Sometimes I know.
I never had to unmute so many times. So starting again with empathy, right? Dictionary says empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So I've been having a lot of discussions with the African American community, because I think when you sit down and you have conversations, you can empathize with others. And so I had a conversation with someone who said to me, I might not be able to change someone's culture, the way they grew up, but I'll never give up on trying to have someone have empathy towards others. And so in a lot of conversations that I've had, which have been many, a lot of them have hit my core. And so God bless her, I have a 31-year-old daughter, and she could pass for an Italian, very light skinned. Sometimes I've been in places with her and they'll look at her when I say she's my daughter. But I've also had a lot of conversations with African American moms who tell me, before my son leaves my house, I have to have that conversation with him. And it's very heartbreaking to have a mom tell you that they have to sit down with their son, because if they're stopped by the police, they have to put their hands on the steering wheel. They have to act a certain way. And as a mom, I can't even begin to feel what she's feeling, because I've never had been through that, but just to have your son, your child, your daughter leave your house with the fear of them not coming back is a horrific situation to live in. And I had a conversation with someone about that today, and she said, "Are you kidding me? I've been having this conversation with my Black child since he's 7 years old." And so, I just want to open up the dialogue with that. So anyone who has input on that.
Yeah, so I want to touch on one of two things. Y'all got me so hot I had to take off my blazer. I want to touch on one of two things. I have the privilege of managing what we call the Empathy Network. I want to talk to you a little bit about what the Empathy Network is, talk to you about how the remarkable leadership of Majority Leader TJ Clark has been very influential and both instrumental in the city of Hartford, supported by Mayor Bronin's leadership, and I'll make it a little bit more granular. But the Empathy Network is currently made up of more than 300 plus organizations and more than 3,000 people throughout the United States of America. So we are the largest bipartisan coalition of impacted organizers and advocates of its kind. The Empathy Network was actually activated to ensure that those who are most impacted by the justice system has a seat at the table and are able to lend their voices and expertise to develop policy solutions that will impact their lives. So in short, those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, but often furthest from resources and power. And the reason why we called it the Empathy Network is because we are on a mission to create empathy, to really make sure that people are far much more literate in their IQ of what empathy is. We embarked on an empathy tour literally last year that was about 20 something cities, if I'm not mistaken. Van Jones, who is, our boss, he came out with a series on CNN that was called The Redemption Project. That was rooted and grounded in empathy. And so with that context, I want to get just a little bit more granular about how we can engage one another in empathy. Last week, the week before last, if you would have asked me how I was feeling, I would have said, as a Black man in America, albeit as light-skinned with natural blonde highlights and hazel eyes that I do have, I would have said that I'm infuriated. If you would have asked me how I felt last week, I would have said I was depressed. This week, I'm hopeful. And the reason why I'm hopeful is because I watched something that was on ESPN by Bruce Lee or about Bruce Lee that's called Be Water. And essentially what Bruce Lee was talking about, he said that water is the most softest substance on earth. And it takes the shape of whatever container that you put it in. So you might be asking me, Louis L. Reed, what are you talking about as it relates to being water, as it relates to empathy? Here's the thing. There is a tidal wave that is rising up in this country that is literally washing us. And on all four corners of this country, it's washing us from racism, it's washing us from mass incarceration, it's washing us from discrimination, it is washing us from all of the filthiness that America has refused to bathe herself in approximately for 200 years, if you want to argue back to the days, back to the time of Reconstruction. And so not only is it cleansing us of the aforementioned issues, but it's also drying us off in empathy. We are having a conversation that is grounded in empathy. We are having a conversation that is grounded with being more, with seeing a reflection of ourselves in the eyes of one another. And that is what empathy is. That's a long way of saying it. Let me also close by saying this, if I can tap into the little preacher boy that's inside of me. Look, there is something that I'm certain that might tickle the Chiefs fancy when I talk about this. There is something that we have in our country. It's called the Good Samaritan Law. That Good Samaritan Law is actually grounded in a biblical notion that can be found in the book of Luke. And what you saw there was something that MLK profoundly articulated. He said that the priest and the Levite asked if they responded to the cause of the man who was injured, what is going to happen to them? But the Good Samaritan said to himself, if I don't respond to the cause of this man who is injured, what is going to happen to me? And so I think that Empathy is really about what is going to happen to the individual that I don't respond to. Not necessarily about the me, but this is about the we. And if we keep moving forward in these hard conversations, if we keep getting the chief on a call, along with the city council president, along with the Louis L. Reed, along with the Jacqueline Manning, along with the Curtis Porters, along with the chief executive officer of a city such as Hartford, we are going to break through an empathy that is going to be greater, is going to be brighter. And on the other side of this, when we emerge in this next normal, not the new normal, but the next normal, I guarantee you we're going to be better off.
All right. Who gonna follow that? I know somebody is.
I got it. Well, listen, man, that was powerful. I appreciate you. I actually watched Van Jones and that special, so I know a lot about what you're referring to. So that was a powerful segment. So if you haven't had an opportunity to do so, go watch it. So for me, I learned about the 7 different elements of empathy. And the first for me is about cultivating curiosity about strangers. And I'll personalize it because I personalize everything. My heart's on my sleeve. So this is how I'll use. My father attempted to teach me how to hate Black people. This is my father. I'm Puerto Rican. My father's Puerto Rican. My father's a fair-skinned Puerto Rican, really light-skinned, more Spaniard features. And he always used to say this term about Black people. And I was a kid, maybe 5, 6 years old. I don't know the difference. Then I moved with my mom to Sands in Hartford. And Sands at the time was all Black. And my mom was the only Puerto Rican family that lived there, my mom and us. And I first started having experiences where I was being called a mira and a bunch of other terms that they used to refer to me as. So I would get mad and I would fight them. And then my mom went ahead and befriended my godfather. My godfather is African American. And I started living with my godfather. When my mom went to jail, my godfather took me in. And it was the first time in my life as a kid that I started having curiosity for a stranger. And that stranger taught me that this Black person, right, this African American, this man was kind. He was caring. He took care of me in my greatest time of need. So I learned to start appreciating not his color, right, but the facts that he was so kind to me. And then I started saying, wait a second, that person who was defined as Black and by my father, who tried to make me hate that person, is no different than anybody else that shows love, empathy, and compassion and support. That African American is a beautiful person. And since then, I haven't turned back. And I had a conversation with my father many years later about the fact that he was wrong about the lessons he tried to teach me. So for me, empathy was about the curiosity that I had for that person. Second is to challenge your prejudice, challenge any biases that you see. Listen with the intention to actually understand. You have to listen. If you're listening because you want to get your point across, but you're not listening to understand, you're failing. You have to inspire social change. Massive social change is part of having empathy. Then you have to develop and go beyond your comfort zone and have a conversation with that person that hates you. The person that you feel is racist. You have to have that conversation and understand from their perspective why they hate you, and inform them and do your best to educate them as to why you're equal, why you both can have fear, why you both can bleed, why you both can have uncertainty, why you both can suffer from many other things that human emotion can escape. And I think that if you apply those things and you assign those things to empathy, you'll have a greater understanding of why you need to have empathy for other people who are suffering. And I think that that's another way of approaching empathy.
Thank you, Iran. I'm going to call on Arunan. And I know I said I wasn't going to call on people, but I do want to make sure that we've heard from folks. So I'm going to give you my order. I'm going to Arunan first, and then I'm going to go to Luke, and then I think I see Andrea trying to get in here. So go for it. Oh, Curtis. Yep, I see you. Got it. Wait, and I haven't heard from Jack in a minute, but go, Arunan.
Sure. I think there's a lot of good thoughts there. I think that someone alluded to the story of the Good Samaritan, and I think about this sermon that Martin Luther King preached about the Good Samaritan, and that story comes after he's asked what it means to be good, right? And Martin Luther King says that Jesus takes that story and puts it on a very specific path on this path to Jericho Road. And he talks about the people who pass the Good Samaritan along the way, and the priests that passed the Good Samaritan along the way. And he said maybe they had good intentions in mind. Maybe they were going to start a Jericho Road economic development project. But he talks about how nobody really sees the Good Samaritan. There are all these people who have their own ideas and visions of how they can improve the world, but they don't actually see the person in front of them. And I think Iran spoke to it really poignantly, but empathy starts with us seeing each other. And I think that that's really difficult in this day and age. We are already naturally disconnected, and COVID has made it so much more so. But I think we also have this blessing of there's this time in which we can kind of stop and take in our surroundings and take in the society we've created, and take in each other. And I really hope that we start to see each other, that we see each other's pains, but that we also see the light that breaks through the brokenness in each other's lives, and that we are a part of that light in each other's lives. And I agree that this panel is a great place to start, because there are so many wonderful people here who are doing so many wonderful things in our city and around the state and around this world. But I just hope that we start by seeing each other, and seeing each other in our full selves. And I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to do that in these couple hours.
Thank you. And so I should be a better moderator and remember who I said next. So if I shift this in the moment, I do apologize. But Jackie, I'm going to you next.
I'm unmuting myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I love the topic of empathy, and when I actually got the flyer and that was on the agenda to talk about, I was like, oh, thank God, because I think it is hard. I see in society we have, with technology speeding up, we're very disconnected. We talk about things in sound bites, and something like what we're talking about tonight, like racism, requires such depth of conversation, such depth of connection with one another, and to take the time to listen. But, in the platforms that we tend to communicate with these days, which is like the social media, it's a soundbite, and people are just kind of like throwing out opinions, and it's fast and it's quick. And there is this, I think it was Ivan who said it's kind of designed, I think, the system to be that way. And for us to kind of lose connection with each other and have soundbite sort of images of one another. And I wear my heart on my sleeve all the time. And I love people of all race, creeds, religions. I just have this big heart, and I'm curious, and I like to listen, but and I just really enjoyed listening to everybody, and I'm like a sponge, I soak it up. But a lot of the times we feel like we're not heard in society, so we have to scream, and everybody's screaming, but hardly anyone stops to really listen. And I just find it's in the listening posture that you have empathy for others. And then also when you stop, at least this is my personal experience, is when I listen to people and then I go to speak, they're more apt to listen to me if I listen first. So I love the topic of empathy, and I think we need to spread it, like empathy and compassion. And I think we need to spread it. And I think that that's sort of what kills our apathy, because apathy is a real problem in our culture in America. It's a quick feel good, hurry up, run to the next thing, run. And this COVID has been a blessing in that we've been able to stop and take pause and reflect on what's going on and our relations with each other. And it's been a blessing. I know it's affected a lot of people, but in that regard, to slow down, it's been a blessing. So yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie, for sharing that. And I think part of the problem with this is I'm listening a lot and not doing my moderator job. So Curtis, you're up next.
Thank you. Just want to, touch a little bit about what Louis mentioned about, when this shift and this rebuild, right, of everything. And I remember a couple years ago when I was running for national president for my fraternity, Lambda Theta Phi. And I remember having a conversation with my founding father of my organization. And, you know, I was telling him some of the challenges and things like that that were going on with my sexuality and with being Black in a predominantly Latino fraternal organization. And he let me know, he was like, Curtis, it's when we look at each other and realize and empower people that we are human beings. And it's when we uplift each other and when we see each other as human beings that we'll have that empathy to, you know, for my brother or my sister or for them, you know, to just have that empathy and see them and see folks and see me as a human being. Because, you know, as we know, the Supreme Court justice just passed some major decisions for DACA and for the LGBT community. And it's just like, why is it that when I wake up or when others wake up, right, they have to think about so much, right? Think about them surviving. Think about, you know, how they should act when they leave the privacy of their home. Think about, you know, are they going to even make it home that day? And it's just like, you know, when are they going to see me as a human? When are we going to look at each other as humans and have that empathy? And it's when we get to that place that we're human beings, you know what I mean? In this upbuild that I also you know, and feeling hopeful for that, you know, folks can keep that in mind with keeping that empathy and looking at one another as humans and not, you know, to have the bias or the discrimination or the tear down just because they may not act like you or look like you or sound like you.
Thank you. Okay, I think I said Luke was going to be next. So Luke and then Andrea. And we need you to unmute, Mayor, if you're speaking. And then I think you unmuted and then mute. There we go.
Sorry, every time. You know, just coming back to Lewis's, where Lewis started and talking about the movie or the video that I watched and Iran watched a couple months ago. It's Lewis, remind me. It's the Redemption. No, what? Remind me the name.
It's the Redemption Project.
The Redemption Project. And that particular, you know, episode of it was focused on a father of a beautiful young girl who had been killed in a drive-by shooting, coming to a meeting with the person who had, as a young man, had killed his daughter. And it was one of the most powerful things that I had seen. And it was really the core of what empathy means. I mean, to be able to, even in the face of that much grief and pain, to try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand what was it? What was this other person's experience? You know, thinking, for example, I was having a conversation recently with some people about bullying in schools, and recognizing that there's two parts to the bullying. We have to protect the person who's being bullied, and we have to understand the person who's doing the bullying almost certainly it has experienced deep trauma, and that's rooted in something that we need to try to help heal in them too. Just being willing to put yourself in others' shoes and to try to understand in a different way. And I do feel like we are at a time when for a while, it's felt to me like there's been a death of empathy in our country. And it's partly for the reasons that Jackie was talking about, that so much of our discourse happens in these platforms where we are separate from each other, where we're not looking into each other's eyes, where we don't have to experience the discomfort of disagreeing with somebody face to face, where, you know, you can just sort of fire these shots out into the ether. And I think it has more than just you know, sort of limiting our discussions to 160 characters. It has taken empathy out of a lot of those interactions. And one of the things that's been most powerful about this moment over the last few weeks has been seeing a lot of people who didn't expect to see, carrying Black Lives Matter signs or showing up to protests, coming out and partly saying, I want to raise my voice and add my voice to that, but partly just saying, I want to understand it in a new way. And so I hope that's something that we can capture and keep from this moment and preserve for a long, long time, because that if we lose our capacity or our interest in empathy, then it makes almost everything else really, really hard.
Thank you. All right, Andrea.
Yes, I was thinking about the empathy question, and I realized that I went on this quest for empathy for really selfish reasons. And this was around the 2016 election because, and I say it was selfish just because I couldn't move to Canada, even though I wanted to. But I found myself waking up the morning after the election saying, what is going on in this country? Like, I did not recognize, I mean, don't get me wrong, I knew that there was this divide, but I could not understand where this sentiment came from, this sentiment of just hatred for President Obama, this sentiment of just us versus them. And so, I'm a big fan of Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so I had read Between the World and Me beforehand. And then I read Hillbilly Elegy, which was it was almost like Between the World and Me from the rural white perspective. And I read it because I was really just seeking to understand. And that's how I found empathy, because their experience was very different over the course of some years from others, right? And so, unpaved roads and the methamphetamine crisis. And so there was they felt this sense of oppression that I had not known about because I don't live there, right? I don't live in those communities. What I found I found myself understanding to a degree, right, why they felt the way that they felt. But then I also found myself wishing that there could be more of those book exchanges and more of those conversational exchanges. I think what happens, and this is not to put HPD on the spot, Chief, but I think what happens with law enforcement too often is when we do have officers who come in to communities that they are unfamiliar with, when their ecosystem or their circle does not include people that look like the communities that they serve, or they do not look like the communities that they serve, they only have this one notion, right? It's what they see on TV and it's what they experience when they're out on the beat. And that is where the lack of empathy comes from, because they've made a decision about who people are on the basis of that. So for me, empathy is just being intentional about trying to understand someone other than yourself, someone other than your circle, your ecosystem, your community.
Thank you for that. So we're nearing the end of our time together. We have a few moments still, and before we go kind of into the final section of this, I'm going to devote the next 5 minutes to a question that takes us from defining empathy and seeing it how we can do it to some more concrete ways in which empathy can start today. So if we're from any perspective you have, we're only gonna have about 5 minutes here. So not everyone will get to speak a full minute or preach a sermon, but give me kind of your 30-second. What can we start doing today to increase our capacity for and our demonstration of empathy? Go, Curtis.
Letting those folks who may not have access to what the rest of the community may have access to, connecting with those who feel that they don't have a voice, right? And letting them know that they do, and bringing them in, right? again, we're here, right? We knew about this information, things like that. But I always think about those who don't have access and what their limitations may be, or those who are not in the know in the silos of Hartford. And so it's really, really connecting with those who may be connected to those folks in those different pockets of the community, and really listening, right? And then and hearing that story, because storytelling is a powerful thing.
Thank you. Others,
I
what
would
can
say,
we do now?
I would say quickly, what we have to do is figure out a way that once we are able to return to educating our children via school or our programs or whatever it is, that we take an opportunity to seize on the momentum that we have for people that may be enlightened, have a new perspective on the suffering of people of color, and start using the platforms that those are to start actually telling the real stories of the suffering that we have endured for way too long. But I think that's another way of having people understand the true nature of what we're battling against. And I think that once you learn and develop a capacity to see the injustices that have been levied against our people, that you can develop a sense of understanding and empathy. And I think that's another way of doing it. We have to start with young people in all schools, across the country, listening and understanding to the different stories of people and the suffering that they have been through so they can start to feel for those people, not just learn about
Great. Anyone else?
So I guess just really quickly, there's an educator, her name is Bettina Love, and she wrote a book about abolitionists in education. And in that book, she talks a little bit about Bree Newsom. And Bree Newsom, most people know, is the girl who climbed the pole to take down the Confederate flag after Dylann Roof went into the church. James Tyson was the guy who was with her, right? James Tyson, Bree Newsom didn't know each other, but they had come together as a group to decide that the flag needed to come down. So Bree Newsom goes up, she climbs the flag. The police come, and they're like, oh, we can get her down, we'll tase the pole. James Tyson puts his hand on the pole because he knew that the police were not going to tase the pole with a white man's hand on it. We need more people to be willing to put their hand on a pole. Don't be an ally, be a co-conspirator, be an abolitionist. Figure out in what ways you can put your hand on a pole for someone else that needs that, and be that person.
I couldn't even imagine that I was going to cry. And that story just brought tears to me. So I'm trying to keep it together. And I think that's a wonderful way to close this segment of our conversation and move into our final remarks. I do want to thank everybody who's been on the panel. I'm going to order our final remarks in a particular way because I know the person who brought us all together, Mally Rosado, should have the last word. So I'm going to start with Arunan and move through however you all want to move through, and then move to Mally as being the last person. Tonight, we've talked about racism, we've talked about discrimination, and we've moved into some solution-based ideas around representation and empathy, and how we can each walk away tonight becoming a little closer to our goal of dismantling racism. I want to give each panelist 1 minute to offer any final remarks you want to have to our listening audience and to each other, because we've all sat in a listening and speaking posture tonight. And right now, we're all going to listen carefully to the final 1 minute wordings of our panelists, starting with Arunan.
And thank you. I just want to start by saying that you guys have all told such beautiful stories, and I think that one of the best things we can do to build empathy and to move to the next step is telling those stories to people who don't have similar stories. I think that part of understanding each other and seeing where each other comes from it's difficult and it's vulnerable and it's tough, but there's such a beautiful collection of stories just shared in the last 2 hours that that I hope you guys share with your friends who don't look like you and who may not always think like you. And I think that would be huge. But I also think that, you know, the fight for civil rights did not come by building consensus, and I think that we should speak clearly to what equality would look like and what building an anti-racist society would look like, and be unafraid of what people think about that. You know, I think the idea that we have these 18 square miles of Hartford in which resources are choked off from us, and people live in suburbs right around the corner and send their kids to different schools and access completely different systems of support. That is a core of the system of racism in this state that allows Black and brown folks to be segregated and kept in this bubble and cut off from resources. And I think across each of our systems, in education, in healthcare, in housing, we can point to how systems have intentionally disadvantaged people. And we should be bold in talking about those things. We should be bold in talking to our friends about it and talking to policymakers about it, and calling it what it is, which is racism, and lovingly and with empathy. But I think we should be clear about what it is. And so those are my two things.
Thank you. Who's next? I'm not calling on anybody. Whoever's ready and next. You got the word.
Can I
Oh, yes.
follow? So first, thank you. Thank you, Mali, for inviting me. Thank you, Takisha, for moderating, facilitating the conversation. As someone who was born and raised in the city, for many years I had a fixed mindset. And my fixed mindset was based on what I was being taught by not only my parents and their condition, but my community. It's an unfortunate situation. So I'm going to challenge all the viewers and all of you on the panel to make a concerted effort at changing a fixed mindset to a growth mindset in order for us to help develop our communities of leaders that are going to surpass us in what we've been able to accomplish. I also want to stress how important it is for us to help our communities remove the survival mode mentality, meaning that many times we're in survival mode and we're taking actions that hurt ourselves and hurt our community because we want to survive. Somehow, some way, these systems have to start working in our favor to get us into progress mode. How you get there is obviously going to take all of us lifting the weight, but we need to get into progress mode. How do we achieve progress, baby steps at a time, in order to impact the community? And lastly, lead with service. If you are a person who wants to understand what communities that are being profiled, are being segregated, are going through, become a leader that's leading with service. Get out there and experience what that is. Be in those spaces, be in those communities. So not only you develop empathy, but you develop a leadership mentality that's centered around compassion and love and peace.
Thank you, Iran. You all are so diplomatic and well behaved. We don't have a lot of time for that. So I see Lewis off mute. Let's go.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a number to text J-Lo, and I'm not talking about Jennifer Lopez. I'm talking about justice, legislation, and opportunity. That is what we need in this space right now, so that we can convert this moment into a movement. If you want to stay connected with us, Cut 50, I immodestly say this: we are the most winningest criminal justice reform organization in recent history of the United States of America. And so if you want to stay connected with us, if you want to be a part of our empathy network, simply you can text the word empathy to 97483. Again, in the event if you got Cricket Wireless, if you got Boost Mobile, if I buffered as I was, giving you a code, let me give it to you again. You can text the word empathy to 97483. Let me say it again for the people in the back. In the event if you didn't hear me, empathy to 97483. You text the word empathy to 97483. I promise you, we will introduce you to J-Lo, who will give you a much better performance than what she did at the Super Bowl halftime show. We're talking about justice, we're talking about legislation, and we're talking about opportunity. Now, I guarantee you, we are going to win different because we fight different. And when we fight, we win.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I think I see Curtis off mute. Go,
Yeah,
Curtis.
absolutely. To that, Louis, is the time has been, and the time is definitely now more than ever. Do not allow folks to pay for your privilege or our privileges that us as human beings deserve, right? The time is now to be a disruptor, and be a disruptor for those policies, be a disruptor at the LOB, and be a disruptor at those polls, and get out there and vote. All right? You have the power. Make sure you exercise your rights and get out there and disrupt that system that's out there oppressing us. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I just want to say, Melly, thank you for putting this together. And it's just been such an honor and really to hear all of you share. I just think we need to have more of these conversations. I think we need to address the pink elephant in the room, talk boldly, speak boldly about the issues, and call out what's going on exactly as it is, and not keep trying to call it by other names, nicer names. We do have to start acknowledging what's going on in terms of our in systemic racism. But I'd just love to see our community come together where we can have leaders in the prosecution in Hartford and probation in Hartford, the mayor's office, the chief's office, the boards kind of come together and have a conjoined effort, because we have to approach this from a holistic perspective. If we want to have reform, we need it on all levels, and we need all the leaders in those positions to be on the same page to divert people away from the criminal justice system and towards resources. And I am definitely going to text empathy to 97483 because I want to learn more about what you got going on there too. So, all right, thanks everybody.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes and 3 people left. So before I turn to Mally. So Andrea, you're off mute. Let's go.
Okay. First of all, Molly, thank you so much for creating this space for this conversation. I think it was much needed. I hope that it is something that continues and becomes contagious. I think I want to end where I started, right? Recognize that you can have racist thinking without being a racist if you were supporting the policies and systems that disproportionately impact people of color. I am hopeful that this is the reckoning that it feels like with George Floyd. I'm thinking people realize just how long 8 minutes and 46 seconds is when someone is dying in front of your eyes. Hope that the anger and the frustration and the desire for change actually translates to these people that are out in these streets registering to vote and showing up at the polls, because that's where the change is going to happen. But I can't give up, because I got a baby who's going to give me a grandbaby one of these days. I don't know, and I want the world to be better for him or her, or however he chooses or she chooses to identify. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Jason and Luke, either one of you. I see Jason off mute, so I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, I'll go quick and leave it to the mayor and council president. I just want to thank everybody for coming together and having this talk. I believe that it's with sometimes uncomfortable conversations that we can improve. I think us, especially in law enforcement, have to be adept at getting involved in these conversations, like the mayor and like Council President Rosado. And I thank them for their leadership in this. I've been out there quite a bit, talking to a lot of people and listening and hearing things that I didn't think of. Things that no one person can make the changes that need to be changed here. It's going to take all of us to look at what we can do in our circles, in our lanes, to push this change. And I agree with Jacqueline. This is an opportunity for all of us to get together to make that positive change. So I thank you for having me part of this discussion. I look forward to doing it again. And with that, I'll turn it over to the mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Takesha, and thank you so much, Mally, for calling us together. I do hope that conversations like this continue to happen and happen more, a lot more than they did before, because I think we talked about, and was in our conversation about racism, and racism partly as about people and what's in minds and hearts. Changing that is going to take a lot of work, and that's probably not going to happen all that fast as much as we want it to. But I do think that at moments like this, changing systems actually can happen a lot faster than you think it can. And I think at moments like this, things that seemed impossible for a long time may become possible. And so whether it's issues like, where does a trash burning power plant get located? Or what does an education funding formula in the state look like? Or can we get a clean slate bill passed through the legislature? Those are things that I think really could have a profound impact on what racism, systemic racism in our state looks like, and whether we can actually chip away at it and make some progress. And I think this may be a moment when on some of those systems, we actually can make some really good progress. And so I think that's the moment we have to seize. And then I know this is a little off topic, I know we're out of time, but I promised I would not have any conversation where anybody might be watching where I didn't say to everybody, fill out the census. Because we talk about voter suppression in other places. We look at voter suppression in Georgia. But if our community in Hartford does not fill out the census, we're suppressing our own vote. Fill out the census. It's tied into all this other stuff, even though it might not feel like it.
Thank you. And Mally.
Hi. I just want to thank everybody for taking 2 hours of their time to have this conversation that was so much needed. Takesha, thank you. I also want to thank David Grant, who's part of my team and has done an exceptional job putting this together. Gil from Hartford Public Access. And, not today, a couple of weeks ago, I made a commitment to myself that if I saw something that was wrong, I would speak up, that I would not take it anymore as a human being. It's very hard to listen to moms have conversations with their kids. And the reason I say that so much is because it really does hit my core to, emphasize with other people what they're going through, to put myself in their shoes. And to be honest with you, we can protect our children in our home, but once they leave, we can't. So I also made another commitment to myself, and that would be that I would not be on a panel that would not have women, men, and Black and brown people. And that's something that we really need to discuss and move forward with. When we talk about equity and inclusion, everyone has to be on the panel. And like I said like the mayor said, please fill out your census. And while I was here, I really, heard what a couple of you said, is that, we have, Hartford being 85% minority, a lot of residents who don't even have internet. And with the COVID-19, they're not able to get to the library. They're not able to come out. So how do we get to that population? Maybe it's neighbors talking with neighbors, but we can be better than what we are today. And as an elected official, I'm honored to serve with our great mayor. We have a great police chief that is always willing to pick up that phone at any time of the night and go out there when the community asks that he does. And through this, I am asking the city of Hartford that I am willing to try. We are willing to try. Are we all willing to try to come together, to not talk at each other, but with each other, to try to understand and move forward? And I think that with everything that's going on as elected officials, I am going to call on our state delegation and put a panel together. We need to sit down where we're at. And this is not about someone putting legislation to have a 15-minute on TV or in the newspaper. This is about all of us coming together and doing what's right for the people and moving forward. And with that said, I think it's 8 o'clock. I want to thank you all again, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all for being a wonderful panel tonight and allowing me to see your humanity by calling you by your first name and not your title, in case anybody who was listening thought that there was something untoward to that. If you were excited about what you heard tonight, please join us for part 2 of this conversation on June 30th, where we from 6 to 8 p.m. the same time, where we'll engage the faith-based community and other community leaders on next steps in addressing racism and racial healing in Hartford. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Takesha.